Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in front of you to discuss today about the modeling of terrestrial targets. And to be more precise, I will actually discuss the modeling of temperate, either Earth size or Earth mass, or sometimes even both planets or exoplanets. I would like to start my presentation by actually this movie that has been made by some scientists from the NASA Goddard Institute, team from GEOS5, and that shows you the evolution through time in the atmosphere of the Earth of various types of what we call aerosols or particles, such as dust in red, carbon, sulfates, and sea salt that are propagating in the atmosphere, and that trace the air movements in the atmosphere of the Earth. And I think they are what we call great tracers to show you the kind of movements of air you may have in the atmosphere of the Earth, and the kind of chaoticity and complexity you may have when you are interested in such things. So there are, in my view, two extremely beautiful things in this movie. The first one is that this movie actually comes from a numerical climate simulations. To be more precise, it's actually a three-dimensional, free-running of full 3D global climate simulations. But what I think even more beautiful behind somehow these simulations is that the equation, the physical and chemical equation that you need to model to go to that kind of results is actually quite limited in number, and most of these equations are thought to be rather universal in a way that you can potentially apply them to simulate the atmosphere of exoplanets. So in the next slides, I will discuss with you what do you need if you want to build your own global climate simulator, your own three-dimensional global climate simulator. So the first thing that you want to have is what we call the dynamical core, which is somehow numerical code that will solve the hydrodynamical equation on a rotating sphere, and that will allow you on a three-dimensional grid to simulate the air movement at the large scale in the atmosphere of your planet. The second thing you want to take into account is the radiative transfer through the gas, the aerosol, and the way, simulate somehow the way the gas, the clouds, the hazes, the surface absorb, scatter, and emit lights on your planet. The third component you want to simulate is what's happening near the surface in the boundary layer with processes such as turbulence and convection. The fourth component you want to take into account is the way surface and subsurface interact, mostly thermally, through heat thermal equation, for example. The fifth thing you want to take into account is the thermodynamics, which is the way the condensable species can either accumulate on the surface or evaporate, for example, forming clouds, and then precipitate, and then they will affect the radiative transfer by reflecting or absorbing some light. So of course, here I chose the blue color for you to feel like you were at home, but you can imagine a planet where you will have a completely different component, for example, lakes of ammonia or whatever types of extreme condensable species. And the last thing you want to include, if you want to be even more sophisticated, it's some photochemistry, for example, to account for the possible presence of stuff like photochemical hazes. And so if you are able somehow to include all these components all together in the same model, then you can start to simulate as close as possible on the computer the way planet will potentially behave in reality. So this is really what you want to do if you want to do that. But in practice, in literature, in the nature, there are a wide range of different types of numerical climate model. It's sometimes hard to make the difference between one paper discussing about one climate model and another. So I will try to review with you all the hierarchy of numerical climates of various degrees of sophistications and various degrees of complexity. The first model I could think of, the simplistic numerical climate model I could think of, are the radiative convective model, the 1D radiative convective model that assume that the entire atmosphere can be modeled in one vertical atmospheric column. And the first version of this model is what we call the inverse climate model. And I will take an example here of an atmosphere, a 1 bar pure and nitrogen atmosphere, to show you how we process to compute that kind of model. The first thing you want to do is you will fix on this diagram the surface temperature to the value you want. Then you will fix the minimum stratospheric temperature. So you can either do it arbitrarily, or you can do it using complex radiative transfer, or you can use it using what we call the skin temperature. And if you want to know more about this, I recommend you to have a look at what I call the Bible of planetary climate scientists, also known as the book of Ray Pierre Humbert. And frankly, I just would like to say that if you're a PhD student and you are interested in this topic, you should definitely read this book, because for me, during my PhD, it helped me really, really a lot. So thank you, Ray, for writing this book. It really helped me. And the third thing you want to do if you want to construct your atmosphere is that you will assume that the atmosphere is convective. And so you will start from the surface and you will compute the thermal profile, assuming the atmosphere follow what we call the convective adiabatic lapse rate. In this case, it's a dry convective adiabatic lapse rate because we assume a pure nitrogen atmosphere. But if you start to add condensable in the atmosphere, for example, water, so I will add 0 Pascal of water, 5 Pascal of water, until the point that the condensation curve of water start to cross the temperature profile of your atmosphere, then you will start to condense water, and you won't follow anymore the dry adiabat, but you will follow the moist convective adiabat instead, which is a bit more complex because it includes the effects of things like latent heat, for example, release. So you can stack even more water, but at some point, if you keep the temperature at the temperature of the present-day Earth, you won't be able to add more water than what thermodynamics law and Clausius-Clapeyron law tells you. So if you want to add even more water, you need to increase the surface temperature of this planet up to the point that you can start to stack a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. And in this case, actually, you have so much water vapor in the atmosphere that you have to actually modify the adiabatic lapse rate in a way that you account for the fact that water vapor can be the dominant gas in the atmosphere. And if you want to know more about this, I recommend to have a look at this list of papers. And if you really, really increase the temperature, then you will reach the point where the temperature will be above the critical point of water. And so you will again start to, let's work. Sorry for that. To follow a dry adiabat right here. Yeah. And so last thing you want to do is when you have constructed your thermal profile and mixing ratio profile, is you want to compute the radiative transfer in both the short wave, so in the range of irradiation, in the range of wavelength where you look at the light emitted by the star, and in the second channel, which we call the long wave channel, which is where you look at the light that is emitted by the planet itself, by the atmosphere and the surface. And once you do that, you can somehow compute the equilibrium irradiation at which your planet must be to be stable. So this is the first kind of model that have been used, for example, to in two, I think, landmark, I will call them landmark papers. The first one is the paper by Ravi Kopparappu, in 2014, that computed the so-called habitable zone. And the second very interesting paper I had in mind was this paper by Caroline Morley that used that kind of approach, for example, to compute various synthetic spectra, in the context of GWST observations. The second type of model, which is still a 1D radiative convective model, but that is a bit more sophisticated, is the time-marching version of the climate model. The idea here is that you will fix first an initial temperature and mixing ratio profiles, and you will define a number of time steps at which you will calculate for each of the time steps some physical and chemical processes like convection, like radiation, like photochemistry or whatever. And from this calculation at each time step, you will derive some heating rates and some mixing ratio tendencies for each layer of the atmosphere. And that way you will let your atmosphere evolve toward a static or dynamic equilibrium. And if you want to know more about this, I recommend to have a look at this model I've developed during my PhD, which is an online versatile model that you can use to explore by yourself what is a 1D time-marching climate model to explore possible atmosphere of Earth-like planets. And I will show you an example here where we will follow on this graph several types of quantities: surface temperature, water vapor profile, temperature profiles, orbit, and the energy budget at the top of the atmosphere. We'll first start with a planet that looks like Earth. So at each time step here, we calculate all the processes I told you about to let the planet evolve. And then suddenly, we will change the eccentricity of the planet and the surface temperature and the temperature profile and the water vapor profile will respond in somehow in a time marching way to this external forcing that will allow you to compute the variation in all of these quantities through time. Can also, for example, increase change the stellar spectrum of the planet, which will change the way the upper atmosphere will evolve through time. That allows you, for example, to compute, compared to the 1D inverse model, self-consistently the upper atmosphere temperature profile of your atmosphere. I think the best paper I have in mind that took advantage of this 1D time marching model is this paper by Antigona Sigora in 2010, where they used somehow the power of this model to explore the response of an Earth-like atmosphere to strong stellar flares that may affect, in a time-marching way, the thermal profile of the atmosphere and the ozone profile of the atmosphere. Then, if you want to go a bit more sophisticated, we go to one more dimension, and we'll go to what I call the two-dimension energy balance models. And so the idea behind this model is that you have some layers that you can decompose either during the latitudes or the longitude, and at each of these layers on your planet, you will compute locally the 1D radiative convective climate calculation, and you will connect somehow this layer one with each other using things like simple heat diffusion-like equations. But if you really, really want to be able to solve self-consistently the hydrodynamic equation on your planet, you need to go to 3D. And so I present you the first here kind of three-dimensional model that have been developed. That's what we call the general circulation model, also called GCM. But the first one I would like to discuss with you are the one that are with simplified forcing. The idea of general circulation model is to have a nice solver of the hydrodynamics equation on a rotating sphere, but very simplistic physics, very simplistic radiative transfer, thermodynamics equations, to allow you to compute quite fast the kind of circulation regimes that you may have on the planetary atmospheres. And this was, for example, the kind of model that were used by Yoav Kaspi and Adam Schoeman a few years ago to compute the different kinds of atmospheric circulation regimes you may have on terrestrial-sized planets. For example, this plot shows you how the rotation rate may affect the size of the ADs developing and the way they are able to transport it from the equator to the poles. So very useful models. The last type of model I would like to introduce, and they are also the type of model I will discuss more extensively during the rest of my presentation, are what we call three-dimensional global climate model. The goal of this model is really ambitious because the goal is to reproduce all the possible processes, physical processes, chemical processes at play in a planetary atmosphere to try to simulate on a computer as close as possible how planet behaves in reality. Really the goal of this model is to build models that behave exactly as real planet in the real world. I show you, for example, here a simulation of a terrestrial-sized planet that was performed here, assuming that you had the planet covered by a lot of water. On the left, you have an in synchronous rotation. Sorry, on the left, you have a map of surface temperature, and on the right, you have a map of the deglaciated part of the ocean. And using that kind of model, you can compute like a lot of things all together, how the clouds behave, how the sea ice will reflect light, or the sea ice get transported, and a lot of components at the same time. And actually, we'd like to make two possible extensions to that kind of model. The first one, I call it the three-dimension global climate model with an ocean circulation model. And this is, for example, what scientists such as Michael Way have been doing the last years at the Rocky 3D, with the Rocky 3D global climate model. And that allows you to compute at the same time not only the atmosphere in 3D, but also the ocean in 3D. That allows you, for example, to show that the kind of planet I showed you before should look very differently. That's exactly the same condition, but just you add an ocean circulation model, and it shows completely the surface temperature and the open deglaciated ocean patterns. The last kind, or the second kind of possible extension to this global climate model is what I call the global climate model with a converged volatile cycle, to simulate planets that are volatile limited or that are water limited. In reality, if you have a planet that has a very low amount of water or a very low amount of condensable species, you won't expect it to be covered exactly the same over the planet. You would expect it to go at very specific places. And in particular, in this case, you would expect for a tidally low planet, the water and the condensable species to end up on the night side, on the two gyres, to be more precise. And so that kind of combined three-dimensional global climate model with the simulation of the migration of the reservoir of water and other kind of condensable species allow you to simulate that. So although I will be discussing more during the rest of my presentation what you can do with this kind of three-dimensional global climate models, I must acknowledge that we need all of this model. All of this model each have some good size and downside. Like for example, the 1D radiative convective model, they are not aiming at reproduce as close as possible the real planet, but they have the advantage of being so computationally efficient that you can explore a wide range of parameters. While the three-dimensional global climate model are aiming at modeling all the physical processes, all very complex and sophisticated physical and chemical processes at the same time, and can help you to better understand how atmospheres in reality should behave. So we really need to use all that hierarchy of numerical climate models at the same time to learn more about this kind of planets. I will move on now to the second part of my presentation, which is terrestrial targets. What are the terrestrial targets and what kind of object I will be talking about? So in this plot, I will show you several recent discoveries that have been made of terrestrial temperate targets that I define as having either a minimum mass lower than 5 times the Earth mass, or either a radius lower than 1.5 Earth radius, or either and a flux, that is at least 5 times lower than the insolation on Earth. And I will show you on this plot the several discoveries of that kind of planet that have been made through time, starting from the date of the first discovery of an exoplanet around a sun-like star as a function on irradiation and the distance of the system from us. So we'll go through time. You have to be patient. I will go a bit faster. To wait till 2011 to have the first non-contested planet, I will say. So I had to do some archaeology because I'm too young to have lived what I would call the JG581G controversy. But I actually realized that the first planet that was discovered in this regime is HD 85512b. It has not been contested yet. So maybe it doesn't exist, we don't know yet. But this is potentially the first planet in this region that have been discovered. But then starting from 2011, we've started to accumulate a lot of interesting targets in this range, so TOCTE and then the JG667 system. And then we started with Kepler and K2 to have some transiting exoplanets. And I go forward, and now we are in 2019. And we actually start to have a lot of these targets. 2019, right now, we have about 40, 50 of these targets, of these terrestrial targets in this regime. So there are clearly two populations that you can see on this diagram. And the first one I would like to discuss is the population of radial velocity, the planet that have been discovered from a ground-based spectrograph, from which we know the mass, from which we know also that they are potentially non-existing due to potentially a stellar masquerading effect. But for now, we don't know if any of this planet is transiting. We know that, for example, there have been several papers on Proxima b showing it does not transiting, but we don't have any clues about most of the other planets shown in blue here. So the two techniques that are available to characterize better this exoplanet, the first one is the thermal phase curves, and the second one is the direct imaging. And from that point of view, from that perspective, the best target we have in mind from this first category of planet is definitely Proxima Centauri b. Thanks to its extreme proximity, things like direct imaging, taking advantage of the very high angular resolution of the planet, we may be able, first with the ELT and even before potentially with the VLT using the high resolution technique coupled to the direct imaging technique to characterize potentially the atmosphere, clouds, and surface of Proxima b. The second population of planets we have are the planets in red, which are the transiting planets. So as you can see, most of these planets are Kepler or K2 planets, and because of observational bias, they are super far from us. So they are not really suitable for future atmospheric characterization. But very luckily, I don't know how lucky we were, but probably very luckily, a few years ago, some Belgian astronomers discovered a fantastic system, the TRAPPIST-1 system, a super nearby system, that actually may be suitable, not only because of its proximity, but because also the type of star is very special, the ultra-cool dwarf star, to use technique such as transit spectroscopy. And this is particularly promising in the context of James Webb Space Telescope. There are a few common points between all the discoveries. The first is that most of these interesting targets are orbiting low mass stars, and I should even say very low mass stars, mostly due to observational bias of all the techniques that have been used to detect these exoplanets. The thing I would like to point out is that this is also due to the fact that most stars in the universe and most stars in the neighborhood are actually cool stars, red dwarf. And I would like to point you a number I really like. Among the 100 most nearby stellar systems, there are a total of 98 M stars. That's a lot. But before I go further on how to model these targets, how to model these objects, I would like to remind you a few things. A few differences you might expect between planets orbiting a sun-like star, like the one in the solar system, and planets orbiting low mass stars, and even more very low mass stars. The first difference that has been already pointed out during this week is the way the luminosity of this object, of the star, of the host star of this object, behaves through time. And actually, due to the long extension of what we call the pre-main sequence phase, in which the star tries to contract and get rid of its initial accretion energy, the planets of the system are expected to be much more highly irradiated, pushing most of the volatile and potentially even water on the atmosphere of this object. The second thing you need to account for, like another difference, is the non-thermal emission of the star. Here is like an observational spectra of what is the top of the atmosphere flux received on Earth, on red, and on black, the top of the atmosphere of Proxima b, as you can see. Also, the black body temperature and the black body spectrum of Proxima Cen is at much larger wavelength. That's what you see at the top here. There is a significant contribution of the non-thermal emission for wavelength below 150 nanometer. And this will potentially, as I've been pointed out earlier in the week, to a huge atmospheric escape. And the last difference that you may have between this kind of star is that we expect, due to the tides exerted, the tides exerted by the star on the planets that are orbiting around them, to be particularly strong on that kind of system, and forcing the planets orbiting such low mass stars to a state of very slow rotation, and possibly as slow as the synchronous rotation, with planets having one side permanently facing the host star. So, of course, if you put all these ingredients together, this has some interesting implications if you want to know more about what this planet could look like. And the first one is that imagine that you have the Earth, and you make it live the same history that this planet had to live, planets orbiting ultra-cool stars. So let's imagine here you have the star, the ultra-cool star. Doesn't really work. Here you have the planet, like Earth, and here you have in red the zone at which you would expect the volatile to be either in the atmosphere or either to condense on the surface. So as the planets go through the pre-main sequence phase, the stars go through the pre-main sequence phase, the planet spend a lot of time in this region of space where most of the volatile are expected to be in the atmosphere, thus exposed to atmospheric escape. And so if you take a planet like Earth and you make it live this kind of evolution sequence, then you would expect it to end up completely dry. So that's a possible option for that kind of planet. But what if, as has been pointed out again earlier in the week, what if we start with planet, due to formation history and due to migration history of this planet, with much larger water content? large enough that it can actually survive this pre-mean sequence phase during a much or significant fraction of the planet lose its atmosphere and its volatile content. Then if you start rich, you have to remain rich. And so this is these arguments that have been pointed out in this paper quite elegantly in the Tian and Ida 2015 paper that actually demonstrated, starting from a population of a terrestrial planet with different water composition, that you could actually, if you are looking at planets here at the top orbiting M stars, so very low mass stars, to end up in two populations, populations of extremely rich in water, extremely rich in volatile, CO2, CH4, whatever time of volatile, and a second population on the left of planet completely dry. So they acknowledge actually in this paper that it may not completely be true, especially if after this pre-mean sequence phase, you have later delivery through impact, for example, or later outgassing that will bring back some volatile in the surface and in the atmosphere of the planet. And if you want to know more about that, I recommend you to have a look. If it's still there, at the poster by Kevin Moore. So that leaves you with four different possibilities. Like either the planet is dry, airless, and then if it's the case, I think most of us, or a significant fraction of us, will have to find a way to recycle us, or to go to different type of planets, I would say. Second possibility, these planets are volatile rich, so like hundreds of times Earth, water, ocean content, water worlds, or CO2 worlds, or CH4 worlds, like crazy things. Either here, you have planets that went at some point completely dry, but later on was replenished either through outgassing or either through volatile delivery, or either what I will go on the this side, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, like planets with hydrogen-rich atmosphere, helium-rich atmosphere, planet with ammonia, planet with freedom gas, I don't know, that kind of object. And so that's quite hard, actually, based on these four different scenarios to imagine how we can use our climate models to learn more about what could this object really look like. Because if of this scenario, and especially the dry airless planets replenished by volatile and the volatile rich scenario, both could lead you to very different kind of states. So we tried actually to think about it the other way around. Let's assume we don't know anything about these planets. Let's assume we don't know how much water they have. Let's assume we don't know how much greenhouse gas they have in the atmosphere. But let's imagine for each combination of possible water content and each possible of greenhouse gas content, what could the atmosphere and the climate and the surface of this object look like? And so I will discuss specifically in the case of synchronous rotations, what kind of climate you could expect for that kind of temperate terrestrial sized planets orbiting M star, as a function of two parameters. We believe there are the two main parameters that control that kind of object, that kind of climate for this object, which is the surface water reservoir size here on the x-axis and the greenhouse gas content. So maybe I should go like plot this like this to show you that basically the two main parameters are how much water you have available on the surface and how much greenhouse gas content you have in the atmosphere. And based on these two parameters, you can try to speculate on the kind of climates you may have on these synchronously rotating planets orbiting in temperate orbit around M stars. The first kind of climate you can reach is, for example, if you imagine that you start with a planet with a very low water content and a very low greenhouse gas content. In that case, GCM simulations actually predict that you will, most of the ice, most of the water that will be present on the planet should accumulate on the night side of your planet as big glaciers and be trapped as the scheme I show you on the upper right of this diagram. If now you move on to the upper part of this diagram, you increase a lot the greenhouse gas content in your atmosphere, then at some point, your atmosphere will be so hot that you will expect all the water to end up to be trapped in the atmosphere of your planet, quite similar to what's happening on present-day Venus. In between, you have a lot of exotic and intriguing states. The first one is a state where the glaciers are exactly at this limit where they are flowing far enough that they can start to melt and produce liquid water at the edge, forming lakes and things like that, and then evaporating back in the surface. This has been illustrated by this image, also called, some people call it like the hot eyeball planet. And this one pointed out first by Jérémy Lecomte in his 2013 paper, where he actually showed using GCM simulations that at the edge of the glacier, you may have a stable cycle where the ice flow, you produce some liquid water. The liquid water, as it produces, it expands, it evaporates quickly, it goes back in the atmosphere, and then it migrates back on the night side of the planet, accumulating on top of the glacier. And you can actually show with GCM simulation that this kind of climate can be stable. The second possible type of climate that you may have is if you have a bit more greenhouse gas, you may be in this specific case, if the topography is right, like having some impact crater lakes on the night side of your planet, to accumulate some liquid water lake on the night side of the planet. If you go now to much larger water content, so on the right part of the diagram, so by large water content, I mean large enough that you can start to cover entirely your planet of water, then depending on the amount of greenhouse gas you have in the atmosphere, you would expect to be either in a case of ice-free ocean, so planet completely covered by ocean, or what we call an eyeball planet. And this was actually here the result of GCM simulations. But again, as I told you at the beginning of my talk, if you include an ocean circulation model, we should stop or maybe use a new term to describe that kind of object, lobster or stingray planet. So you can pick up the name you prefer. And I will leave you a few seconds to have a look at these nice images, the one on the left that was done in the context of the TRAPPIST-1 discovery by artists at the NASA JPL, and on the right, a picture that was drawn by French artists of lobster or stingray planet. So I like quite a lot the picture on the right. I don't know if you had seen it before, but nice work. There are some very interesting states in between. For example, between the case where I told you that most water should be trapped on the night side and water should completely cover the planet and drive you to something like an eyeball planet. And for you to understand them, I have to use some figures from the Yang et al. 2014 paper and some result from the Kristen Manu 2014 paper. Actually, the idea is that there are some B-stabilities in this diagram. And one of them is possibly if you start with a planet with all water trapped on the night side, because it's easy to accumulate water as ice on the night side, you could accumulate a lot of it. So this is the first configuration that could be stable, here on the right, where all water is trapped on the night side as fig glaciers. But for the very same amount of water content, if you start with the water as a global ocean, then the heat redistribution by the ocean circulation itself for the same water content may actually be able to maintain such planet stable through time through the replenishment of heat from the day side to the night side thanks to the ocean circulation. And so for a given planet, for a given water content and for a given greenhouse gas content, the two kind of climates, which are quite different in fact, may be both stable depending on the initial conditions. I just would like to discuss a bit more about what's going on the right side of this diagram. If you look at it more closely, you could have paid attention that the right side of the diagram is almost blue, which is blue everywhere actually, which indicates that if you are on the right side of this diagram, so if you have high enough water content that it should completely cover your planet, then one of the results of this GCM simulation is that possibly whatever the amount of greenhouse content gas that you may have in your atmosphere, you should have some liquid water on your planet, either as an ice-free ocean or either as an eyeball planet or a stingray planet or a lobster planet. And I will try to give you some arguments on why this kind of planet seems to be quite robust in this particular state. I just would like to acknowledge that, to the best of my knowledge, the first one that pointed out the existence of this kind of climate was Ray Pierre Humbert. I don't know if you confirm, or you're the one to. I did some archaeology, and the first paper I've seen about that were you. Is it true or? So that inspired a lot. And even though this work was done on a planet that doesn't exist anymore, it was super useful for a lot of PhD students, including myself. And so there are a few arguments that have been advanced to explain why this eyeball planet or this aqua planet may be super robust. The first one has been advanced by Jade Schöckler, which is in the room. I don't know where she is. But she actually showed that due to the geometry shape of the insolation received by a synchronous planet, so on the below, so this is the graph here. On the top, you have a typical insolation received by the Earth, and at the bottom, you have the insolation received by a synchronous planet. As you can see, the sharpness of the insolation for a synchronous planet is much higher than for an Earth-like planet, indicating that because most of the flux is concentrated on one single part of the atmosphere, the substellar point, it's much harder to glaciate this specific part of the planet. The second argument that has been advanced is by Manoj Joshi, which is also in the room, and Rob Aberle in 2012, where they have shown actually that due to the spectral response of ice and snow depositing on the surface, the spectral albedo of water ice and snow that I showed you on the below in here in this plot has a strong dependence. So it reflects a lot in the visible and it absorbs a lot in the infrared, where you would expect stars, very low mass stars, to emit much more flux, which means that ice and snow have a much lower albedo around very low mass stars, indicating that the ice feedback and the snowball feedback that will lead you to a snowball is much lower. So the second argument is ice albedo feedback is super weak on that kind of objects. The third kind of arguments I can advance is clouds. Clouds, again, will help you to stabilize that kind of object. This has been shown first by Jun Young in 2013. The diagram is from Jérémy Lecomte. The idea is that if you have an aquaplanet, eyeball planet, you would expect at the substellar point to have a strong convection, as you have seen on some of the talk earlier on this week, that will lead you to a cloud formation at the substellar point that will reflect light efficiently. One of the key points of this feedback is that if you increase the stellar flux received by the planet, you will increase the strength of this convection. That will increase the number of clouds and the reflection of clouds, which will tend to cool the planet. And so these clouds, these substellar clouds planet, they also tend to stabilize the climate, the atmosphere of your planet. The fourth type of ingredient of component that also help you to stabilize your planet is heat redistribution and the way atmosphere is able to transport heat. If you want to understand that, these are some simulation that shows you the surface temperature for, here it was TRAPPIST-1e, for different surface pressure. As you can see, if you go to very thick surface pressure, the atmosphere is so thick that although it redistributes heat very efficiently, sorry for that, it also produces a lot of greenhouse effect, so you would expect the entire planet to be covered by liquid water. But if you go on the other side, so this side, if you decrease the atmospheric pressure, at some point, because you decrease the atmospheric pressure, you will decrease the greenhouse effect, but you will also decrease the efficiency at which the heat is transported from the day side to the night side. So if you do that, you will increase the temperature contrast between the day side and the night side, but it will tend to increase locally at the substellar point the surface temperature, which will again maintain you in a eyeball state. Sorry. The only case where this might actually not work is the pure theoretical case of what happens if you go even beyond that and you completely remove the background gas. So you are in the case of a planet that is completely covered by water, and the only gas you have in the atmosphere is water vapor, which has to be produced because of Clausius-Clapeyron laws. And these are some results that have been published recently by Ding and Pierre Haber in 2018. And they actually shown on the left diagram, this is here the plot, that if you do a simulation of a pure steam atmosphere, you would expect, because of the way that kind of planet transport heat through latent heat exchanges between the day side and night side, to have a planet that is almost completely isotherm. That's what you see, the numbers you see on the y-axis. They're almost the same. The planet will be completely isotherm. So that will kill somehow for planets that are below a threshold at which the water should be in the ice form. This idea that eyeball are robust. But there is a last argument I would like to advance, which is the fact that pure steam atmosphere should not be stable. Because if your planet is completely covered by a steam atmosphere, your steam atmosphere should get photodissociated and you should accumulate through time, especially some oxygen that should build up in the atmosphere until the point that where you start to accumulate high enough oxygen or non-condensable gas in the atmosphere that you break the cold trap, and then you start to come back to a more Earth-like case with a bar or so of oxygen or over non-condensable gas. So that being said, one of the aspects now after doing this is to say, okay, what can we learn from this exploration, and can we explore whether or not these different kind of climates and these different kind of situations may lead you to different kind of synthetic observables that we could possibly observe with the existing and the forthcoming telescopes. One of the projects that we are currently running right now is a project that we call the TRAPPIST Habitable Atmosphere Intercomparison Thai project. We call it like that because it started in the Thai restaurant. And it's a group of scientists, some of them are in the room, that started a huge intercomparison between four GCM, four global climate model, the LMD GCM, the CAM model, the METOPHIS model, and the Rocky 3D model, where we wanted to do two things. The first thing is that we wanted to know, for the specific case of TRAPPIST-1e, whether or not, by using similar input data and putting us in similar conditions, do the model agree or not when we put the model in the same condition. And the second thing we wanted to do is whether or not these differences in the model could lead us to different observable signatures. And I think this is the kind of studies that is super useful in the context where we want to know how much can we trust this kind of GCM to prepare and to understand the future observation and that will be made with telescopes such as the ELTs or such as the James Webb Space Telescope. So I'm now moving to the last part of my presentation, where I will discuss very rapidly the kind of improvements that could be made to improve those global climate models. And I think, as most of you have seen in the previous talk this week, that a way to really improve this model is to go to high resolution. You can do this in two different ways. You can first go to super high resolution, but then you have to decrease the size of your simulation, so decrease the size of your planet or put your planet in a box. That's what you do if you want to do a large ED simulation or a cloud resolving simulation that has been presented earlier in the week by Denis Sergeev and by Maxence Lefebvre. And I show you some animations here of the work that have been presented by Maxence earlier in the week. The idea here is trying to model all the processes that you cannot resolve at the scale of a GCM that are subscale processes. And from that kind of exploration, we believe that maybe we can learn more about the process and then include them in the unresolved, in the GCM where these processes cannot be resolved. If you really have a lot of CPUs available, if you are working on a big supercomputer, then you can also move, and that's what most of the GCM are doing right now, on super high resolution GCM. And to do that, you can take advantage from a specific grid, such as the icosahedral grid, that are made to be parallelizable, which allows you to run simulation, GCM simulations at super high resolution, and taking advantage of the fact that if you use a large number of core, you can parallelize your model, and so you can potentially, as given you have an infinite number of core, go to an extremely, extremely high resolution. And if you do that, you can start to better represent the effect, for example, of the topography on your planet, the things like waves and filamentation of traces. The second possible option to improve this GCM is to improve the parametrization that are behind, that are used in this GCM. And I think the best example, if you followed all the talk this week, is the case of the convection. There are a lot of discussions on what's the best scheme to do the convection, and all the models. If I go back to to the GCM intercomparison movie I show you here. You see some differences on the reflected stellar radiation. That is actually the means that there are differences in clouds formation on this different GCM, which means that there are probably lot of differences in the cloud in the convection scheme. We have a lot of work to do in this specific area, and one way to improve our understanding of way convection work in non-Earth, in exotic conditions such as synchronously rotating planet, is to go for higher resolution, and in particular to use things like large eddy simulation or cloud resolving model to learn more about how cloud convection works when you can resolve it and then use it as input in the GCM that cannot resolve it to better simulate the effect of unresolved parameter or unresolved physical processes on the large scale and on the evolution potentially of such planets. The second thing I would like to emphasize is that we also need to improve our knowledge of input data that we use on these GCMs, such as spectroscopy data, surface albedo data, cloud aerosol properties, ASIS microphysics, etc., etc. And I would like to show you just one example to give you how important this kind of data, input data in the GCM can be important. And I will focus on these two studies that have been published. I think half of the authors are in this room, which is also an intercomparison studies that explored first in 1D and then in 3D what could be the difference between radiative convective model or global climate model in terms of surface temperature, temperature profile, water vapor mixing ratio for planets that are in synchronous rotation for this case and rapidly rotating. And so one of the results of this intercomparison was that maybe some differences, some significant differences between the models are due to, I can read it. For example, we find that an increase in atmospheric absorption of shortwave radiation can lead to higher relative humidity at high altitudes globally, and therefore a significant decrease in planetary radiation emitted to space. So clearly, there is a strong dependence or a strong variability between one model and the other due to the different spectroscopic coefficient or absorption coefficients for molecules such as water vapor. And I would like to give you one example of something we call the water vapor continuum. So it's the part of the spectrum for water-rich planet that corresponds to the far-wing absorptions of the line of water vapor. In this case, it's self-continuum, self-water vapor continuum. And this is the continuum that you can download if you get what we call the caviar, or actually similar in the BPS continuum, which shows you the strength of the water vapor self-continuum as a function of wavelength. And this, in the trough of the water bands, this point here corresponds to data points that were measured in Fourier transform spectroscopy experiments in 2013 and 2015 by Plashnik et al. And actually, the whole database of the water vapor continuum for caviar in this case is based on this experiment data. Here, these two experiments. But actually, it was shown later using much more precise experiment using what we call CRDS, or cavity ring dome spectroscopy measurements, that are much sensitive to much lower absorptions, that the data points that were measured in the caviar experiments were probably biased by either a wrong calibration or either stuff like water vapor condensing on the parcel of the box of the experiment. And so if you look, for example, in the near infrared, in this region, where you would expect the flux of very low mass star to be quite high, you can have as much as 2 orders of magnitude between one database and the other, which means that whether or not you will use, for example, the caviar database of the MT-CKD 3.2 database that have been recently updated, you will probably get a different sensitivity to the effect of water vapor that could accumulate in the upper atmosphere of these objects. And therefore, that could have a significant effect on their climate and on the possible atmosphere they could have. Now, I would like to finish with this slide, so it will be my last slide. And I haven't talked much about observations during my presentation, and I know that the talk that will follow mine by Anna Wakefield will focus on that. So I will leave her all the pleasure to do that. I just would like to show you this plot because the objects I've been talking about during my talk are objects that are thought to be difficult to characterize or amenable only to future observation with the James Webb or with the ELTs. But what if we actually already had some interesting data to start to characterize not only the interior of some of these planets, but also their atmosphere? And actually, I believe that this diagram that shows you the density measurements of the TRAPPIST-1 planet that have been performed by combining radius measurements through the transit technique and mass estimates using transient timing variation data, that we can start to get some information of this planet. These density measurements, the fact that we have 7 density measurements for different planets, also now the error bar are still huge, but in the future we would expect them to go down lower, lower, and lower. We can start to make some prediction on what kind of atmosphere may lead some signature on this diagram, what kind of things we could see. For example, if the planet follow the same interior composition, what can we infer from that? Or if the 6th planet follow like the same interior composition, but only one planet in the system is much lower density, what can we infer from that? So there are a lot of ways, just with this diagram, by imagining in the future that this diagram will be better constrained and better constrained to get more information on the planet. So my point with this diagram is to say, maybe we already have data, interesting data on these planets, and maybe we should try to focus on that kind of information to learn things about that kind of planet. And so that will be all for me, and thank you.
All right, we do have time for questions for Matthias. Do we have any from the audience right now? Yes, Nick?
We don't have the mics at the moment.
Oh, we don't have mics. Perhaps we could just kind of repeat the question until we find the microphones,
yeah, okay.
or like summarize them?
Yeah, I mean, so you wrote this great paper about thermal tides, atmospheric thermal tides, a while ago. And are the theorists who are modeling these planets as highly locked, are you just in denial about this, or like, is there a way to like do this self-consistently and actually just check for your given simulation whether that planet would actually remain highly locked?
Yeah. So, for example, for this, yeah. So the question was about the paper by Jérémy Lecomte in 2015 that showed that maybe atmospheric tides could drive a planet out of its synchronous rotation because it could act against the solid tides. And actually, this is something, for example, so for the sake of this presentation, I've discussed everything in the case of synchronous rotation, but there have been a lot of work that have been done in the case of non-synchronous rotation. And this is clearly something that could affect the tides, atmospheric tides could definitely affect the evolution of planet. I just would like to point out that in my understanding, the result of Jérémy, but maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, are mostly for planets orbiting standard mass stars. If you go to really, really low mass stars, like the Proxima Centauri planet or the TRAPPIST-1 planets, then the atmospheric tides or their effect is much more limited. And so there are other effects, such as planet-planet interaction, for example, that could lead you to higher eccentricity and that could trap you in over resonant states, or like pseudo-synchronous rotation stuff, or like that could be an issue, and that could drive you out of synchronous rotation, or at least as we model it. But for the object I've discussed, I don't think atmospheric tides are the main candidates for driving you out of synchronous rotation. But maybe tell me if I'm wrong, or... Okay.
There's a sweet spot. Too far away, you're not synchronized. If you're too far in.
Yeah, there is a sweet spot. If you're too far away, tides won't do anything. If you're too close in because of the scalings, the tides on the crust are really crushing you, and there's not much you can do. And when you go for like early M stars and then K and then you should be non-synchronous.
All right, do we have more questions in the audience? We have a microphone now to pass around. Yeah.
Maggie Thompson, UC Santa Cruz. How would adding heavier chemical species into your models affect the results, do you think?
Oh, what?
Adding heavier chemical species, so say like sulfur or something, how would that affect the results in the models?
So it depends. So if I think about sulfur, I think two things can happen. Either you can add like a greenhouse gas like SO2, H2S, that kind of stuff that will add more greenhouse effect. So that will add on top of other greenhouse effect. And the other thing I could think of is that maybe you could start to form AZs like H2SO4 or that kind of aerosols that could cool down the planet. So depending on how much you have and what kind of star you are around, maybe they could have like a greenhouse effect or a cooling effect. It's not clear to me. I haven't really explored that topic. So there may be other people in the room that could tell you more about how much one or the other effect could be the leading one, depending on the situation where you are.
Just behind her, I believe.
Hi, Danica Adams, Caltech. Just to follow up on the sulfur, sorry. I've been working with an undergraduate, Skylar Dick, and she'll be at AGU presenting the effects of sulfur, but it's just 1D. So, advertisement.
I think we have time for one more. What's that?
Is there someone back there?
No. Okay.
Right. So, I'm glad you made the point about our uncertainties about the water vapor continuum and the water vapor continuum that you showed from Caviar. There's several water vapor continua that we know even less about. And I just want to make, a pitch for a white paper that Jonathan Fortney led that a lot of us were on, making a plea for more lab experiments because you can spend billions on JWST, but not spend the millions on the lab experiments needed to actually understand it. And Sarah Hurst's lab experiments are a prime example of this sort of lab planetary science that we need more of. But a lot of just basic spectroscopy, like collisional continua, and your own lab work on the CO2H2 collisional continua are every bit as important as the telescopes and so forth. And I hope the funding agencies have more uptake of this sort of thing to really get us over this data gap.
Okay. With that, let's give Martin another round of applause.